Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Adam from Hot Pole Studios here, and today we're going to be talking about building PCs on a relative value budget for audio production. I say relative value because it's not going to be the cheapest you can find. But recently we did a video about comparing a PC build to the latest top-of-the-range iMac, and that was over £2,000, which is way too much for some people. So we're going to look at a machine you can get that's reliable, absolutely solid, and talk about why at a budget of around £900. And we're going to look at both Ryzen and Intel's i7, i5 range, that kind of deal. So, if we very quickly look at the iMac 2019 build that we made, everything was very high cost because everything was very high spec. The point of that one was to compare the top tier stuff to the top tier iMac components. However, in this video, that's not what we're going to do. This 9900K from Intel is nearly £500 on its own. Now, if we compare that to the Ryzen build that we're looking at, it's about £200 for the processor, and the overall price is just over £900, which means that that processor we put in the iMac build would have cost almost half as much as our entire system in this instance. So, this is PC Part Picker, and this is what I'm going to be using for the rest of this video to talk us through components and costs. And also I'm going to link in the description both of the builds from today's video. That way you can have a look at the components, change them if you like, find some alternatives as prices change. They do go up and down. You might find more appropriate parts that are either less cost or more powerful, less powerful, whatever it is that you are looking for. So, let's start at the start, shall we? AMD Ryzen is an absolutely fascinating platform for me when it comes to music production, because up until very recently, if you'd asked me, would you go for an Intel machine or an AMD machine in terms of music production, I would have said, throw AMD out the window, don't even bother, Intel is what you are going with. And that was because up until that point, Intel had been making these very solid, high-performing chips, even though they were more expensive, where AMD's architecture was very old. It was using a lot of power from the wall to not give you very much in the way of performance. I mean, they worked. My desktop PC that's underneath this desk still uses one of the old AMD FX 8350s, and it's not great, but it's there, and I'm not going to buy a new one because my studio computer is a monster, and my laptop is also a monster, so no point. But that's just my personal circumstance. This is what I do for a living. So, let's have a look at what we've done here. The new 3000 series of Ryzen is yet to come out. So at the time of making this video, we're looking at the 2000 series of AMD Ryzen, which are really keeping up and on par with most of the Intel processors at value. And that's the interesting thing here. We're going to be comparing this system built around the AMD 2700, which is a Ryzen 7, and not the 2700 Plus or Max or Pro or whatever they're calling the X that they're calling the upgraded version, which is significantly more expensive for a little bit more performance. What we're looking for here is value, whilst also making sure that all the components that we get are solid, reliable, and a couple of years down the line they hopefully won't have failed on you. That's what I'm looking for in an audio production build. I'm looking for something that's relatively good value, relatively low power usage, relatively fast processor, not bothered really about graphics, solid memory, fast solid-state storage, but also in the value build having a large spinning hard drive to store extra projects on. And I also recommend having a separate backup hard drive externally, but that's something for another time. The cost also includes a copy of Windows 10, and if you already had a copy of Windows 10, you can already knock £80-something off the cost of your build. So, the builds here, we've gone for the Ryzen 2700, but also on the Intel side, we've gone for the Core i5 8600K. Now, why the Core i5, you might ask, compared to the Ryzen 7? Main reason is cost. The i5 compared to the Ryzen 7. The Ryzen 7 processor costs us £200, give or take, and the i5 8600K is more than £240, so it's more expensive. Now, I'm quickly going to pull up a CPU comparison. I'm going to pull up the Ryzen 2700 and the 8600K. Compare these. Right, so these are the numbers we want to look at. So the i5 is more expensive. It has less cores, where the 2700 has 8 cores and the 8600K has 6. The overall performance of the Ryzen 7 is this number 15,000, where the 8600K is 12,700, so it's less powerful. Although if you look at the single thread rating, which could be interesting if you're more of a mastering engineer or you have a tendency to stack loads of plugins on the same channel, which means they all have to be completed by one single core, the 8600K does outperform it by a good 20% in that instance. So it could be that in that setup, that's more important to you. But generally speaking, I find that audio production for mixes, because it's spread out over so many channels, they can be spread out over several cores. More cores can mean more good, which means that the Ryzen, which is cheaper, is more powerful, can handle more plugins, more mixing, more complex mixes. And so for me, that's already the winner. So both of these, I've gone with the ASUS brand for motherboards. I like ASUS. I have good history of using them. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I use an ASUS Maximus 8 Hero in my studio build, and it's never let me down. So that's the main part of our build. They are slightly different per build because the processor is different for each one, which means that we need different chipset, but they're still from the same range. So it's the Asus Prime range, and for the Core i5, I've gone with the H370 Plus. H370 is one of the chipsets that works with the 8600K. There is also the ZZ370, but I think that's possibly overkill. If you're not overclocking the thing, which I generally discourage for audio production, if you're not doing crazy stuff with it, then it's a kind of overkill, and the H370 boards I would consider to be absolutely rock solid for what we're doing. In my studio build, I went for a Z branded motherboard, but I was going for higher cost, higher durability, higher reliability. I was going for overkill, let's be honest. Whereas with this, we're going for solid, rock solid, but also value. Whereas in the Ryzen build, we've gone for the Asus Prime B450. The only real difference being that this is designed around the B450 chipset, which is the chip that works with the Ryzen processor rather than the Intel one. As you can see, they look very similar. They've even got this line down the side here, which looks kind of neat. They've both got plenty of PCI Express slots, and let's go from there. So let's talk about the Ryzen build first. Most of the components that I've picked are identical between these two builds, and that's to try and keep the comparison as clear as possible, and also prove the point that a lot of components these days work perfectly well between the Intel builds and the AMD builds, and they're both absolutely fine to work with either. You don't really have to worry about compatibility so much these days. If you're getting into serious overclocking of memory and that kind of thing, with Ryzen you probably want to look at the motherboard and the chipsets list of memory that they like to use and pick one of them. In this case, I've not really bothered. I've just gone with good old Corsair Vengeance, the LPX memory, which is 16GB, two 8GB sticks. For audio producers, by the way, I definitely recommend getting a RAM configuration, if you're buying from new, that is 2 sticks that are exactly the same, and not like 4 sticks of 4GB or anything like that, because using exactly as many sticks of memory as there are channels for memory on that processor, in my experience, leads to better stability way down the line. I mean, within the first month or so, you wouldn't see any stability issues, but when you've got a real years-old PC, I tend to find that if you're running 4 sticks of memory in a computer, there's a good chance that it'll hang and crash compared to one with 2, and that's just my experience with older machines. And if you're planning on using this machine for many years, it's just something to keep in mind. Also, it then leaves you with 2 extra slots if you ever decide to go crazy with memory. At this time, I don't think there's a need for 32 gigabytes of RAM in most computers, because beyond a certain limit, more memory does not equal more performance for audio, guys. If you're a video producer working with 4K footage, it'll probably help you because you've got some seriously big files to work with. If you're doing like 3D graphical rendering, sure, that's going to work for you, but more than 16 gigabytes of RAM for audio isn't that big file size wise, so we don't need crazy amounts of RAM, but we do need very fast processors. So that's where our priorities lay, that's where our cost should go. Now, if I look at the Intel build, it's exactly the same memory that I've picked. I picked the DDR4 3000 MHz, which means if you do decide to run the memory faster with the Ryzen chip, then that will make the processor run faster because of the way that Ryzen works with the Infinity fabric and all this kind of crazy stuff, where it won't make much difference to an Intel processor, if any, really, depending on what you're doing. The CPU cooler, I do not like using the CPU coolers that Intel chips and AMD chips come with. I find that they're quite noisy, they're cheaply made, they're kind of horrible. So in both cases, I've picked a Corsair H60, which is an all-in-one liquid cooler, but you don't have to worry about water cooling or anything. You literally just get this blob here, and you attach that to the processor itself, and you get the part here, and you attach that either to the back of your case or the top of your case, or anywhere that you can find that it will reasonably fit, and that will take the heat from the processor and push it straight out of the case, which means that it's easy to do, it doesn't take much panic, the fans don't have to spin up very quickly, which means that it's not going to make much noise in your recording room, and that's definitely something that I would want, is not very much noise in the recording room. The H60 does work with the AM4 chipset, which is the AMD one as well as the Intel one, so that's why I've spec'd the same for both. The storage, I've also spec'd the same for both. Western Digital recently came out with these, which really fascinate me. These are, they're SATA, that kind of sucks. I thought these were NVMe. I'm going to have to look at that in some capacity very soon, because I could have sworn that they did this. But anyway, a solid state drive that goes on the motherboard, and it looks like it uses SATA, so it'll cap out at 500 plus megabytes a second, which is still pretty fast. 500 megabytes solid state storage, £56.77, and it slots into the motherboard, so you don't even need a cable to run to something. I think that's still pretty decent value. I would imagine the NVMe version, which is the faster version, would cost a little more. That's the reason that I was checking those out, and I'll have to see if I can find that and put that in the description. But that's something to keep in mind. And the Seagate Barracuda drives, I've always had good experiences with Seagate. I've heard of people who haven't. But then you could say that about any hard drive manufacturer, that if you buy enough drives, over time one will fail. So you really, really should make sure that you've got extra hard drives to back stuff up to. The old mantra for anything digital is if you don't have it stored in triplicate on 3 separate things, it doesn't exist, because there's a good chance that one will fail, and then you try and transfer something off your other drive, that could fail too. It's been done where audio, video, old files cease to exist because the stuff that it was stored on dies. So make sure, even though that's a relatively solid drive, that you don't do that. Working our way down the list, I've gone with the Fractal Design Meshify C. I like Fractal stuff, I think it looks cool. It's slightly wider than the old PC cases, which means that there's space in the back to hide any messy cables, so that it looks nice and neat. There's a dark glass version, there's a light glass version. I just picked the dark one because it was the first one there. But for £78, it's not the cheapest case you'll find, but you can see into it. It's called the Meshify because the front, the sides, the back, they're all mesh, which means that the case is completely open, which means that airflow is going to be great. And the upshot of that is that the fans that you have in that PC don't have to run very fast at all to get the air flowing out, which means that temperatures stay low, your equipment stays healthy and performs well for longer, and you're not going to have to worry about it making too much noise. The other way you could go is you could get a proper acoustically treated PC, but I found in my experience they're actually not amazing because they seal off everything and maybe just have a port at the front and one at the back. You then need to push airflow through it, which means you need fans, which then need to ramp up a bit, which make noise, which in turn can defeat the whole purpose. It depends. Any PC with any moving fan is going to make a little bit of noise. If you have an open case like this, the fans will run very low. You'll get a tiny bit of kind of broadband white noise, but it'll be very, very low. We might be talking 10 or 20 dBA, which is almost below the threshold of human hearing. It's pretty low. If you get one of the soundproof cases, you might have to have two fans in there that are running slightly faster, which means that the acoustic dampening will keep a lot of that broadband noise down, but you might notice that there's a certain whine to the fans, a certain note, and that cuts through on recordings. That's what I've found anyway. Like, when I'm talking now, you can probably hear in the background when the gate doesn't cut in, there's a... And that's actually the fan in my laptop, which is a tiny little fan, but it's spinning up quite fast because I'm doing a capture of the desktop while I'm doing this. And you can hear it on the recording, which for this video I'm not particularly bothered about because it's not the end of the world, but if you're recording an album per se, and you've got that noise in the background, it's very hard to get rid of that kind of noise without sacrificing detail and quality on your recordings, using some sort of noise reduction algorithm. If you're having to fight noise reduction on an album recording, you're already fighting a losing battle, so just my advice is don't. And last but not least, there are cheaper power supplies, but I picked the Seasonic Focus Plus Gold. It only runs 550 watts, but that's way more than I think most of these machines are going to need, because even if you've got a processor running really kind of 100%, if we're doing audio production, there's either going to be no graphics card, or the graphics card isn't going to be putting very much effort in and drawing much power. So we don't need tons of power, but what we do need is efficiency, which is why I chose one that's 80 plus gold rated, which means it's not going to cost you much money to run, it's not going to give out much heat in terms of inefficiency, which means it's not going to run its fans either very much or at all, which means that it's an extra level of noise reduction. Great! And usually in my experience, anything that's 80 plus gold rated or better lasts a very long time and has very little chance of damaging or destroying any of the components in the computer as it gets old and a bit rickety. Prices seem to be dropping on these as well. And it's fully modular, which means that you only need to put the cables into the computer that you need, and instead of having a big tangle of wires hanging out the back that you have to stuff somewhere and hide, you can just leave them in the box in the attic and keep the inside of the computer nice and neat. One more thing to talk about is the price of this Intel machine seems lower at £877 than the AMD build at $926. Why is that? That's because of the elephant in the room, and that is the video card that I've picked, because the Ryzen 7 processor doesn't have inbuilt graphics, and the Intel 8600K does. Now, here's the thing. If you're not running plugins that have any kind of graphical high demand interface, like, you know, the Slate stuff with the spinning tape machines and that kind of thing, you probably don't need an external graphics card anyway. I mean, you definitely don't need a high powered one, but with AMD processors you need one simply because the processor doesn't have one. So I decided, if I'm going to get a processor and get a graphics card, why not get something half decent, which is why I went with the RX 570 8GB from XFX. And the reason I went for this one is that the 570 is a fairly decent value for money prospect at the moment. If you ever decide to do any video editing or play a game or capture your screen while you're mixing, you're going to need a half decent graphics card for that to be a thing. And so I figured, I think that AMD graphics cards are better for audio producers than Nvidia because of their drivers, and Nvidia drivers can try and take over the system a little bit, can interfere, can start to cause pops and clicks a little bit. I'm going to make a video on this if anyone doesn't believe it, because it's only intermittent and it depends on the drivers on the card. Whereas the AMD graphics cards, I've always found, don't have that issue. I mean, it's not even a big issue for Nvidia graphics cards, but it has been an issue nonetheless. So it's something, like I said, I'm going to talk about that separately. But as a value prospect, the RX 570, I thought, you know what, that's decent enough. That you could hang 4 monitors off it, so you could have some absolute monster of a system. I think you can have 2 graphics cards coming off an 8600K, 2 monitors coming off an 8600K. But I did find when I first built the studio computer that I had lots of graphical stuff going on my 6700K, so it's a little older, and it was causing pops and clicks and dropouts and issues. And as soon as I put an external graphics card in, it didn't even have to be a good external graphics card, those problems went away. And my attitude with graphics cards is, why get something that's really poor, that's, you know, a £30 graphics card, when you may as well just splash out a little extra money. And let's see what happens if I just edit this part list and put the same graphics card in. Graphics card, because then that will turn the tables on the cost. 570, 8GB. XFX 570. That one. There we go, same price. So now the price has gone up to over £1,000. It's £1,008.93 compared to the £920 or however much it was before on the AMD build. Yeah, £926. So that's a cost saving of about £80 if we were to use the same graphics card in both. And it's also with the whole passmark thing, more performance for less money. So if you're looking at a budget of £1,000 or less, I really wouldn't recommend going super duper cheap with your build, because that's how components fail and blow up. But if you can afford to stretch to this and you already have monitors, mice, keyboards, that kind of thing, this is the kind of level I would recommend. So like I said, both are going to be in the description. Just before I sign off, thanks for everybody for watching. One last thing, if you've already produced your music and you're looking to get it onto iTunes, Spotify, that kind of thing, consider using DistroKid. I used them recently, and there's a video coming out about that very soon, if not already. They do stuff very quickly, it's very cheap. I think it was $20 a year, and that includes any material you want to put out. And if you want to put covers out, you can do that as well, and they sort it for you, and I think it's $1 a month for the license for a cover, and that's it. If they agree to secure the license, because it's an automated system, then that's done, and you don't have to worry about copyrights and being sued and all that kind of stuff. It's just there, and it's easy. So use our link in the description below, and then you get a little bit more money off. We get a bit of help from that as well. So hopefully that helps you all out. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. I've been Adam Steele for Hot Pulse Studios, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks to all the patrons, and thank you everybody for watching. Hit like, hit subscribe. See you soon. Goodbye. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.